So you might have seen this headline doing the rounds recently. Sounded pretty reassuring, actually, about a major new analysis showing, autism diagnoses happening earlier in boys, but still lagging for girls, framed as, like, uneven progress.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit, because what we really want to do in this deep dive isn't just, look at the numbers on the surface. We want to dig into how those numbers actually got made, who's collecting them, and maybe most importantly, how easily that kind of authority just gets accepted as truth. And really, this isn't just about autism. It's kind of about how knowledge itself gets built and presented now in this age of big data.
Exactly. And that's where it gets really interesting, because the basic disparity boys diagnosed earlier, girls later, that's
not new information. We've been talking about that for decades, haven't we? It pops up all the time in journals, talk shows. What's really fascinating here isn't so much the finding itself, but the source of this revelation and the mechanics underneath it all.
Right, so you see the headline. Looks like a simple story, progress. Maybe a bit slow for girls, but progress. But then, the real story might not be the data points, but who owns the whole system producing them and how that shapes what we're told.
Precisely. Because this data set, the one behind the headlines, it's not from, say, a public health agency or an independent university research group. It belongs to Epic Systems. Now, they often get framed as just a neutral software vendor, providing tools. But calling Epic just a vendor, that really misses the scale of it. It's like saying the people who built the roads are just asphalt companies. Epic controls the actual infrastructure, the digital pathways where over half of all medical documentation in the U.S. flows. That's not just administration. That's, it's structural power.
Structural power, that's a strong term. Can you give us a sense of what that means practically? How does controlling the software give them that kind of power?
Well, think about it. Because so many places use their system hospitals, clinics, Epic gets to standardize how things are recorded, what data fields exist, how doctors and nurses input information, even the drop-down menus they choose from. This uniformity gives them this almost unparalleled view across the entire healthcare landscape. So when they analyze their data, it looks incredibly comprehensive. It carries weight just because of the sheer volume.
And using that position, they've built this thing called Cosmos, which is, what now? Over 300 million patient records, pulls from like 1,700 hospitals, 40,000 clinics. I mean, that's data stitched together from our lives, potentially, from people listening right now. It's kind of a chilling thought, isn't it? Realizing your health story is part of this huge corporate database.
It is. And the key part, legally speaking, is how they handle that data. Epic says Cosmos data is de-identified. Now, under U.S. law, HIPAA specifically, that's a crucial term. Once data meets the standard for de-identification, scrubbing names, specific dates, that sort of thing, it's technically no longer protected health information.
Okay. So that's the loophole.
It's the mechanism, yeah. That legal status change allows all those intimate details, diagnoses, treatments, outcomes to be harvested, pulled together, and mined for patterns, all without needing individual patient consent for that specific use. So legally, it might be derived from your data, but it's no longer considered your data in the same way.
Like someone copying the blueprint of your house without asking.
Sort of, yeah. And it's vital to understand this Cosmos dataset. It's not some public health commons built for everyone's benefit. It's absolutely a proprietary dataset. Owned, controlled, curated by one single corporation.
Okay, so they have this massive proprietary dataset. But then they frame their findings using all the right words, a major analysis, 2 independent teams, clinical experts reviewing the data. It sounds pretty legitimate, doesn't it?
It's definitely designed to sound legitimate. But let's pull back the curtain a bit. Epic Research. That's their own internal analytics department, those independent teams. They're just different groups of Epic employees working on the same project. Their independence is internal workflow management, not like external scientific validation.
Right. Not independent in the way science usually means independent.
Exactly. It's corporate language dressed up as scientific rigor. And it immediately makes you ask, well, what's missing?
And for people maybe not steeped in scientific process, why do those missing pieces matter so much? What's really at stake?
Oh, fundamentally, everything that makes science trustworthy is missing. There's no mention of an institutional review board, an IRB. That's the ethical oversight. Basic stuff. There's no transparent methodology published so someone else could try and replicate it or even just understand how they reach their conclusions. No discussion of the data's limitations, potential biases. I mean, EHR data is notoriously messy, right? No acknowledgement of that.
So conflict of interest statement.
Nope. No peer review, which is critical in science. No open data for others to check. No published code. They've basically skipped, pretty much every standard scientific checkpoint. It's Epic marking Epic's homework.
Wow. So compared to actual science.
It's night and day. Real science puts its methods out there, warts and all. It invites scrutiny from peers. It allows for replication. Epic offers, well, glossy graphics, tidy talking points, a veneer of objectivity, but underneath, it's a corporate product. It functions much more like marketing material, frankly, than actual research. And that leads to a really unsettling thought, doesn't it? If there's no transparency, no independent checks, what stops them from releasing any finding? Imagine a finding that, say, autism rates are plummeting, or, I don't know, that gender dysphoria barely exists in their records if that gets amplified.
It could become accepted as fact, with huge real-world consequences for people's lives, for policy, for human rights, without ever being properly vetted.
Precisely. It could harden into social fact based purely on corporate assertion.
So how does this stuff get out there? Well, you mentioned amplification. ABC News picked up this Epic analysis, and they presented it as, what, a major scientific advance.
Yes, not as, here's what one company's internal data suggests, but as a significant step forward in knowledge.
And the byline adds another layer. Dr. Christian Monsalve, introduced as a functional psychiatry fellow, part of the ABC News medical unit. Sounds crow.
It adds that medical authority. But if you look a bit closer, his focus isn't really on autism research or even primarily autistic patients in his main work. His private company, Verigreat, seems geared towards high achievers using functional and integrative psychiatry. His Psychology Today profile, autism isn't mentioned. It just doesn't seem to be his core area.
So you have journalism here acting less like a watchdog, asking tough questions, and more like, well, a megaphone for Epic's claims. The article didn't really seem to dig into how the data was gathered, the consent issue, Epic's own commercial interests. It just kind of repeated the narrative.
And that's the real danger zone. When media amplifies corporate science without critical analysis, that's how these things become accepted fact, just baked into public understanding. The story ends up relying on borrowed credibility, Epic's scale, the doctor's credentials, the news outlet's reputation instead of actual rigorous scrutiny of the claims themselves. It's narrative laundering almost.
And think about the questions that get lost when the headline just focuses on that simple disparity, boys earlier, girls later. Like, why are girls diagnosed later? Is it the diagnostic criteria themselves? Are the screening tools maybe built around, I don't know, outdated ideas of what autism looks like, perhaps based on white male presentations? Or is it something about how the data even gets entered into those Epic systems, the checkboxes, the interpretation?
But those questions, they don't really get asked in this framing, do they? Because asking them might mean criticizing the system itself. And in this context, Epic is the system, or a huge part of it. So instead, we get this subtle narrative, almost a kind of gaslighting, where the issue is presented as just inherent difficulty. Girls are harder to diagnose. It shifts focus away from potential systemic flaws or biases and puts it back onto the individual or onto nature. The power structures stay hidden.
Which brings us somewhere important. This is exactly why other ways of thinking, like the power threat meaning framework, PTMF, or critical theory, are so valuable.
Yeah.
And why their absence here feels significant. For people not familiar, what do those frameworks bring? What do they help us see that maybe a purely medical or statistical view misses?
At their core, they push us to look beyond just the surface symptoms or the data points. They ask us to examine the systems involved. The power dynamics, who gets to define the problem, the social meanings attached to diagnoses, how history and culture shape our understanding. They ask why on a much deeper systemic level. So frameworks like these wouldn't just accept the disparity data. They'd immediately ask about the power relations in medicine that might contribute to it. They'd question the meaning and purpose of the diagnosis itself within society. How do data collection and surveillance practices maybe reinforce existing inequalities? PTMF, for instance, might see these diagnostic differences not just as delays, but as predictable outcomes. Outcomes of a system designed around certain prototypes, maybe overlooking others, and then solidified by EHRs that force complex experiences into neat little boxes. And critical theory would zoom in on things like, well, whose voices are missing entirely from this conversation? Where are the autistic people themselves in defining these issues? It would highlight how health data becomes a commodity and how corporate research gets laundered into public knowledge via compliant media. It exposes how dominant narratives get reinforced.
So the bigger picture here. This isn't just about one study from Epic or one news report. It feels like part of a larger trend, maybe, where these huge corporate analytics firms, because they hold so much data, are becoming the new Well, the new scientific authorities, they're not just giving us numbers, they're shaping the story the numbers tell.
Absolutely. And when claims like Epic's aren't challenged, Epic effectively positions itself as an arbiter of truth about health, about conditions like autism. That concentrates enormous power, the power to define disability, to define normal, into the hands of private corporations. And their primary interests aren't necessarily scientific truth or public good, but, control, profit, market influence. This isn't just research anymore. It's the consolidation of what we might call epistemic power, the power to determine what counts as knowledge.
And the really profound implication is that the very people whose lives are being described in this case, autistic people, they get pushed out of the center of their own stories. They become data points, entries in a massive, privately owned archive. It's kind of loss of sovereignty, isn't it, over their own reality, their own experiences.
It really is. We have to remember data isn't just numbers. It's lived history. It's experience stripped of context, often repackaged and sold back to us. And when data like this is used without real scrutiny, without consent for these secondary uses, it obscures as much as it reveals. It quietly validates a system of extraction and repositions it as objective truth.
So ultimately, the call here is for transparency, for accountability, and maybe for a collective pause before we accept corporate storytelling as science.
Yeah, and it leaves us with a critical question to chew on, doesn't it? When a corporation like Epic narrates the story of autism, whose truths are being centered, whose experiences are being validated, and just as importantly, whose truths, whose experiences are being pushed to the margins or maybe even erased entirely, these are the questions we really need to be asking, the ones the headlines often glide right over.
Definitely something to think about. And if this deep dive has unsettled you or made you curious, we'd really encourage you to explore some of these ideas further. Maybe look into the power threat meaning framework, the PTMF we mentioned, see what a different lens reveals, and also perhaps look up the history of Dr. Grynia Sukareva. Her work on autism in the 1920s and 30s was incredibly insightful, way ahead of Kanner and Asperger in some respects, but largely forgotten or overlooked by Western psychiatry for decades. Another story often left untold, because maybe reclaiming some of that sovereignty over our own stories, our own realities, maybe it starts with understanding how those narratives get controlled, and then insisting on finding and telling different ones.